Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
At dinner, everyone raised a glass for my sister. She stood there beaming like she'd just solved world hunger, while my father cleared his throat dramatically and gave a toast that honestly felt more like a campaign speech. To Brianna, he said, lifting his glass high like he was knighting her, for showing us what hard work and brilliance can do. Everyone clinked their glasses, smiling and nodding like backup singers in a gospel choir. My mother dabbed the corner of her eye, the dramatic kind of wipe she does when she wants people to notice she's emotional. My uncle leaned in and whispered something like, "You must be proud," and my mom just nodded with that glazed-over look people get when they're trying not to smile too hard. I sat there, holding my glass without clinking it, like I'd just wandered into someone else's celebration. No one looked my way. No one even asked how I'd been. I mean, hell, I'd driven 2 states over to be there. I helped clean out my 401k last year to cover the down payment on Brianna's new office space, but sure, tonight was about what hard work and brilliance can do. My glass stayed full. My voice stayed quiet. When the laughter died down and the dessert plates were cleared, I found myself elbow-deep in soapy water, scrubbing a casserole dish like it owed me money. The others were in the living room, still chatting while I stood at the sink staring out the dark window. The lights from inside reflected back at me, just me, surrounded by crumbs, pans, and silence. I could hear my father's voice from the next room talking about Brianna's networking skills and natural charisma and how some people are just born leaders. And I swear to God, if I had a nickel for every time I heard that phrase, I'd have my own damn office by now. You ever been in a room full of people who know you, grew up with you, lived under the same roof for decades, and still made you feel invisible? That's what it felt like. That sinking, twisted silence that wraps around your ribs and pulls tight every time your name doesn't come up, every time someone else gets the spotlight and you're just background noise. A ghost in your own story. I didn't say anything during dinner. Not out loud, anyway. But in my mind, I said plenty. I thought about all the times Brianna left messes for me to clean up, not just dishes, but real messes. Like the time she wrecked Mom's car and told her I was the last one to use it. Or when she skipped town with her ex-boyfriend and left me to cover for her at the family reunion. My parents believed her every time. Every damn time. Because she smiled and I didn't. Because she cried and I clenched my jaw. After the dishes were done and the house started to empty out, I grabbed my coat and slipped outside without saying much. I passed Brianna in the hallway. She was hugging Aunt Shelley, eyes wet and voice trembling like she'd just given a TED Talk on overcoming adversity. I nodded at her, and she gave me that smile she always used when we were kids, tight-lipped, polite, and sharp enough to slice paper. We both knew exactly what it meant. Later that night, back in the guest room, I was lying there staring at the ceiling, replaying everything. The laughter. The silence. The way my mom barely looked at me except to ask me to check if the rolls were burning. I was reaching for my charger when my phone buzzed. One new message. From Brianna. "Did you say something to Mom? She's been in her room crying all night." I stared at it for a long time, not sure whether to laugh or throw the phone across the room. Because no, I hadn't said a damn word. I didn't need to. Sometimes silence says more than shouting ever could. But that text, it didn't feel innocent. It felt like a warning. Or maybe a confession. Like something had been uncovered, and Brianna thought I was behind it. And maybe I was, in a way neither of us fully understood yet. So I didn't answer her. I just stared at the message, thumb hovering over the screen, heartbeat heavy in my throat. It wasn't about what I'd said. It was about what I knew. And something told me the story wasn't over yet, not even close. Let me ask you this. Have you ever kept quiet during a family celebration, not because you had nothing to say, but because you knew whatever came out of your mouth would shift the whole damn room? Ever held back the truth, not to protect others, but because you weren't sure if they deserved the protection anymore? Because that night, as the house creaked and settled around me, I didn't feel proud of my silence. I felt dangerous. The morning after that text, the house was wrapped in the kind of silence that didn't feel like peace, it felt like a held breath, a tight thread stretched too far, the kind that frays with the slightest tug. I stood in the kitchen pouring coffee into a chipped mug I didn't remember owning, the aroma bitter and oddly comforting, while the sound of my mother's closed bedroom door seemed louder than anything else in the house. No footsteps, no voice, no signs of movement. Just that heavy, suffocating stillness that clung to the walls and followed me like a shadow. I hadn't replied to Brianna. I hadn't needed to. The question she asked still hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one wanted to admit had started. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting it burn the roof of my mouth because in a house like this, pain had always been easier to handle than pretense. I thought about the message again. Did you say something to Mom? She didn't say. Did something happen, or is she okay? No, her instinct was that something had been said, that a truth she worked hard to bury had started to claw its way up through the floorboards. And that said more than she probably meant to admit. Brianna had always been a master at playing innocent, turning her big eyes into shields and her soft voice into a weapon. She could twist a memory into a story that made her the victim before you even realized you'd been cast as the villain. It wasn't the first time I'd been blamed for making Mom cry. When I was 16, I caught Brianna sneaking in at 2 in the morning, mascara streaked down her face, her heel broken, smelling like tequila and trouble. She begged me not to tell, swore she just needed one night to feel alive, and I being the ever-loyal idiot, covered for her. When Dad asked why the garage door had been left open all night, I told him I forgot to close it. When Mom found the ruined heel shoved under the porch swing, I shrugged. But that wasn't the end of it. A week later, Brianna got caught texting some older guy during church. Mom confronted her, and you know what she did? She cried. Cried like her heart was breaking. Told Mom I was the one who pressured her into sneaking out that night. Said I'd been the one with the fake ID. Claimed I was jealous of how close she and Mom were. And Mom didn't even look at me before grounding me for a month. I still remember sitting on the porch steps that evening, legs tucked under me, listening to the two of them giggling in the kitchen like nothing happened. That's when it really sunk in, not that Brianna lied, because she always did that, but that Mom wanted to believe her. That the truth wasn't as comforting as the fantasy where Brianna was the sweet one, and I was the difficult daughter who needed to be managed, kept in line, softened around the edges. It wasn't just that Brianna lied, it was that my silence had given her permission. So no, I hadn't said anything to Mom. But maybe I should have. Maybe I should have 10 years ago. Or 20. That morning, I wandered up into the attic, half out of habit, half out of instinct. The attic was my space when I was younger, where I used to go when the shouting got too loud or the attention got too uneven. It smelled like dust and wood rot, and the floor creaked beneath my steps like it remembered me. I found an old plastic bin labeled Lauren High School. Inside were some yearbooks, a dried-out bouquet from prom, and my diary, the one I kept between 14 and 17, the years when I was still trying to believe I mattered to this family. I opened it, expecting to cringe at old crushes and complaints, but instead, what hit me was the emptiness. Dozens of pages had been ripped out, leaving only jagged edges and the faint shadows of what was once there. My stomach turned. That diary had been locked. I remembered hiding the key in the back of my bookshelf behind an old Babysitter's Club novel. I remembered because Brianna used to borrow my books, pretending she was into reading when she was really just trying to figure out who I was when no one else was around. She used to say, "You're so weirdly secretive, Lauren," like it was a flaw, not a survival mechanism. But I knew then what I knew now: someone had gone through my past, picked and chosen what to erase. And that someone was almost certainly the girl who smiled too much and cried too easily. I sat there on the attic floor, the diary resting open in my lap like a wound, the missing pages echoing louder than the ones still intact. I didn't know exactly what had been torn out, but I could guess. Notes about the night of the car crash. The arguments Mom never wanted Dad to hear. The way Brianna once told me she didn't want kids because she knew she wasn't cut out to be the kind of mother that doesn't ruin her daughters. Things you write down thinking they're safe, thinking someday they'll remind you of what you survived. I walked back downstairs and sent Brianna a message. Short, deliberate. No. Why? Her reply came a minute later. She won't talk to me. Something's wrong. I didn't answer. Because it wasn't something. It was everything. Years of everything. And I wasn't done being quiet. Not yet. It's strange, the way silence can ferment into something sharp and corrosive, the way it doesn't just linger but evolves, gaining weight, growing edges, turning into a living thing that presses against your ribs until you can't breathe right. That's what it felt like in that house the next morning, the air thick with unspoken words and unresolved memories, the kind that sit heavy in your gut like a meal gone bad. My mother still hadn't come out of her room, and though no one had the nerve to say anything out loud, you could see it on their faces, etched into the polite tension of every forced smile and sideways glance. Something had cracked, something that wasn't going to be fixed with a plate of leftover bundt cake or a fake apology muttered over morning coffee. I watched Brianna from across the room as she sat in the living room pretending to read a magazine she wasn't even flipping through, her legs crossed just so, one finger twirling a piece of hair like she was 13 again and trying to charm her way out of trouble. But her eyes weren't relaxed, they were calculating, constantly darting to the hallway that led to our mother's room, waiting for footsteps that never came, waiting for confrontation or confirmation or some damn signal that the world still bent in her favor. She didn't say a word to me, and I didn't offer one. We were locked in that quiet battle only sisters can wage, the kind that uses memories as weapons and shared history as collateral. I didn't ask what was wrong with Mom, and I didn't offer to check on her, because I already knew that whatever was eating at her had more to do with guilt than illness, and guilt, as I've learned, is one of the few emotions you can't medicate away. It has to be sat with, stared down, swallowed whole, and maybe, if you're lucky, choked back up again as some twisted form of redemption. But that wasn't my job anymore, not after a lifetime of cleaning up after other people's messes and being told I was the one who made the room dirty in the first place. Later that afternoon, I met up with Rachel, our cousin, the one who's always hovered on the outskirts of family drama like someone watching a soap opera she's not allowed to admit she enjoys. We met at a little diner we used to visit as kids, back when pancakes and milkshakes were currency and secrets were whispered into napkins like they were sacred scrolls. She sat across from me, sipping iced tea and picking at her salad, but I could tell she had something to say. People always do when they start a conversation with, so I probably shouldn't bring this up, but Rachel, bless her nosy little heart, mentioned that she'd spoken to my mother just a few days before the dinner, and that my name had come up specifically, that Diane had said something about me finally stirring things up again, and how she hoped it wouldn't ruin the celebration. Which was funny, because as far as I knew, I hadn't done a damn thing to deserve that kind of preemptive accusation. I'd shown up. I'd kept my mouth shut. I'd smiled when I didn't feel like it. And somehow, even that had been perceived as a threat. Something in my brain clicked then, a slow and deliberate shift like puzzle pieces locking into place after being misaligned for years. Mom wasn't crying because I said something. She was crying because something had surfaced, something Brianna had told her, or hinted at, or let slip in that way she always did when she wanted to plant a seed of doubt without getting her own hands dirty. I wasn't the problem. I never had been. I was the alibi that didn't hold up under scrutiny, the scapegoat she used to keep her own image clean. And now, finally, maybe the shine was wearing off. I went back to the house with a calm I didn't recognize in myself, like someone who's about to play a game they've already won. Brianna was in the kitchen pretending to cook something she didn't actually intend to serve, banging pots around for show, trying to project normalcy. I leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her like you'd watch a magician after you've already figured out the trick. "I saw Rachel," I said, casually, like it was just small talk. Her shoulders stiffened for a split second, barely noticeable if you didn't know her, but I did. "She mentioned Mom said something about me, ruining things again. Before I even showed up." Brianna turned, spatula in hand, face carefully blank. "She's just stressed. You know how Mom gets." I smiled, a real smile this time, not because I was happy, but because I knew something she didn't. I had already mailed an envelope the night before, a plain, nondescript manila envelope, addressed in anonymous handwriting, containing photocopies of the missing pages from my diary. Not the originals, those were too valuable, but enough to light a fire. Enough to make our mother sit alone in her room for a day and a half, staring at words she never wanted to read. Words written by a daughter she never really listened to. The pages I chose weren't the most damning, but they were enough. Memories of Brianna begging me to cover for her, of Mom saying, "Just let it go, Lauren, it's not a big deal," of me writing that I felt like an outsider in my own house, like the only way to be seen was to become something I wasn't. I didn't lie. I just reminded her of the truth she'd chosen to ignore. I stood in that kitchen, watching Brianna try to pretend her world wasn't shaking, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the quiet one. I felt like the one holding the match. And as I turned to walk out of the room, she asked too softly, "Did you do something?" I paused, let the silence stretch out just long enough to feel like an answer, then said no. I didn't say a word. And that was true. I hadn't said a word. But I had written plenty. And now she was going to have to read every single page. There's a particular kind of satisfaction that comes not from vengeance itself, but from the quiet anticipation of what follows, the unraveling, the realization, the soft crumble of an illusion that someone worked years to build, only to have it falter under the weight of its own deceit. That's what I felt as I walked through the halls of my childhood home, the same narrow spaces where I used to tiptoe around arguments and shrink myself down to avoid being noticed, now suddenly feeling like I belonged to them again, not as a passive observer, but as a force that had, for once, shifted the tide. The envelope I had sent to my mother wasn't explosive, it wasn't laced with venom or accusations, but it was soaked in a kind of brutal honesty that I knew would do far more damage than any dramatic outburst ever could. And now, the echo of that quiet truth was rolling through the house, unsettling the dust in corners that had been untouched for decades. Mom still wasn't speaking to either of us, not in words at least, and though Brianna moved through the house with her usual composure, I could see the panic flickering behind her eyes, the way she kept checking her phone for messages that weren't coming, or looking at her reflection a little too long, as if trying to confirm she still looked like the golden girl everyone adored. I wasn't sure if Doug had picked up on the tension yet, or if he was just playing dumb to keep the peace, as he often did. He had always been pleasant in that way some men are, detached but agreeable, willing to say all the right things without ever really stepping into the muck of family politics. But even he had started asking questions, dropping little observations that made it clear something about the perfect picture he'd married into was beginning to blur. At breakfast, he casually asked if I knew why Mom seemed so distant lately, if maybe she was just exhausted or having a hard time accepting that Brianna was growing up and didn't need her approval as much anymore. The irony almost choked me, how even Doug, sweet, simple Doug, couldn't imagine that maybe the problem wasn't change, but the slow arrival of long-buried truths. I didn't say much to him. Just offered a half smile and shrugged like someone who's learned the hard way that explaining things only makes you the villain in a story you didn't ask to be a part of. But then he asked something that made my stomach tighten. He looked at me, eyes narrowed just slightly, and said, "Was there something in that old journal that really upset her?" It was a simple question, asked without malice, but it landed like a hammer, because I hadn't told anyone about the envelope, not even hinted at it, which meant someone had. And there was only one someone who would have known. I found Brianna in the backyard that afternoon, sitting on the old swing set that Dad refused to take down even after we'd all moved out, her feet dragging lazy half-circles in the dirt like she was back in junior high. I watched her for a moment before I said anything, remembering how she used to beg me to push her when we were kids, only to scream at me seconds later for going too high. That was Brianna in a nutshell, wanting to be lifted, but terrified of losing control. "You told Doug about the journal," I said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, because I already knew. She didn't deny it, just looked up at me with that tight expression she used when she was calculating her next move, like a chess player realizing the game was slipping away. "You sent something to her," she said, voice low, almost rehearsed. "Something cruel." I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because the idea that my words, my lived experience, written down in my own hand, could be considered cruel by someone who had spent her life rewriting the narrative to suit her needs, was so ridiculous I didn't know what else to do. "It wasn't cruel," I said, stepping closer. It was true. Maybe for the first time in this house, someone told the truth. She stood up then, brushing dirt off her jeans, trying to regain whatever sense of authority she thought she had left. "You don't know what you've done," she said, and for the first time, I heard fear in her voice, not anger, not indignation, but real, trembling fear. That's when I knew I had hit something real, struck a nerve so deep even she couldn't pretend it didn't exist. But it wasn't until later that night that the full weight of what I'd stirred up came crashing down, when Doug knocked on my bedroom door, hesitant, unsure, holding his phone like it had suddenly become a grenade he wasn't sure how to disarm. "She told me everything," he said, voice low. About the abortion. About the guy before me. About how she thought she was pregnant when you were in college, and how she came to you first, not your mom. She said she thought you told Diane." I blinked, because that wasn't part of the diary. That had never been written down, not by me. That had been a secret whispered one night in a panic, a memory I'd kept locked so tightly even I had almost forgotten it. Brianna had been 20, scared and utterly alone, and she'd come to me with trembling hands and blood on her jeans, asking me to drive her to a clinic and not tell a soul. I hadn't. Not then. Not ever. But now, faced with the wreckage of our family dynamic, she'd convinced herself that I must have, because how else could the story be falling apart? "I didn't tell her that," I said quietly, meeting Doug's eyes. "I never told her. I never would." He looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable crossing his face, and then asked, "Then why is she crying like you did?" I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure anymore where the blame actually landed. Maybe Brianna was breaking down because I broke the silence, or maybe because the silence had finally stopped protecting her. Either way, something had shifted, something irreversible, and in that moment, I wasn't sure if I'd done the right thing or simply the thing that needed to be done. And as Doug walked away, I realized that the revenge I thought I wanted didn't feel like victory, it felt like exposure. Like standing naked in a house of mirrors and realizing you're not the only one who's been hiding. It had been 3 days since the dinner, 3 long and disjointed days in that old house where time never moved in a straight line but bent and curled around unresolved history, and yet somehow the air still hadn't cleared, the dust hadn't settled, and the silence had grown so thick it seemed to bleed from the walls themselves. I had stayed longer than I planned, not out of politeness or obligation, but because something about this unraveling felt unfinished, like a wound that hadn't yet started to clot. Like the moment just before a storm when the sky turns electric and everyone holds their breath without even knowing why. Mom still hadn't looked me in the eye, not since that envelope arrived and whatever illusions she'd been clinging to finally dissolved under the weight of memory and ink. I had heard her once, through the thin walls of the house, sobbing into what sounded like a pillow, her voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before. Not even when Dad's business nearly collapsed or when she thought Brianna had dropped out of college. This was a different kind of cry, not the performative, martyr mother sob she'd practiced so well over the years, but something raw and shuddering, the kind that sounded like the ground finally giving way under years of denial. And still, I hadn't said a word. I didn't knock on her door, didn't offer comfort, didn't try to soften what had landed like a blade between us. Because the truth was, I didn't trust myself to speak without letting decades of pain bleed out all over the carpet, and if I was going to be the villain in this story, as I so often had been cast, then I was at least going to be the kind of villain who didn't beg for understanding. Brianna, meanwhile, had gone from agitated to brittle, her once effortless smile now a poor imitation of itself, her words clipped and defensive when she spoke at all. Doug had left the morning before, bags slung over his shoulder, expression grim and unreadable, offering me a nod that felt more like an apology than a goodbye. He hadn't said much, and I hadn't asked. Some fractures don't need explanation, they're written into the silence between two people, as obvious as smoke from a house fire. What surprised me most, I think, was how little satisfaction I felt. I had always assumed that if the scales ever tipped, if the truth ever rose above the noise, I'd feel some kind of vindication, like I'd finally reclaimed the narrative I'd been pushed out of since childhood. But instead, I felt hollow. Not regretful, exactly, but not triumphant either. More like I had just stepped out of a long, bitter storm only to find the ground beneath me had changed shape entirely, that the map I'd drawn of who I was in this family no longer fit the terrain. On the morning I finally decided to leave, I slipped out early, the sky still gray and low, the kind of weather that makes you feel like the world hasn't quite woken up yet. I paused on the porch for a moment, taking in the chipped paint on the railing, the uneven slats of the steps, the wind chime that had never been properly tuned but still managed to sing. I could feel the weight of the house behind me, pressing against my back, full of ghosts that weren't quite ready to be named. I didn't go inside to say goodbye. Instead, I left an envelope on the porch swing, the same swing where Brianna and I used to sit eating popsicles and pretending the world wasn't already shaping us into roles we'd never quite agreed to. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, no diary pages this time, no exposition or defense, just a note, handwritten in the same sharp cursive Mom used to praise me for when I was young, and she still noticed things like that. It read simply, I didn't say anything. Not this time. Because, in the end, I hadn't. Not really. I hadn't told Doug about the abortion. I hadn't told Mom about the clinic or the fake ID or the boy Brianna had begged me not to name. I hadn't burned bridges, I'd only stopped holding them up. I'd only let the weight fall where it belonged. As I drove away, the town shrinking behind me into familiar shapes and old regrets, I wondered whether silence could ever really be clean, whether withholding the truth was ever as passive as we like to believe. Because even silence has intent. Even silence can be a scream. Hours later, back home, unpacking the few things I had bothered to bring, my phone buzzed. A message from Brianna. Short. Blunt. You won. Happy now. I stared at it for a long time, longer than I probably should have, thumb hovering over the screen like it might set something off just by touching it. But I didn't reply. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because anything I could say would either sound like a lie or a victory speech, and I was tired of playing either role. I just sat there, phone in hand, wondering which of us had really lost more. Because if I had finally reclaimed the story, if I had truly won, why did it feel like all I had left were ashes? Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it just makes it impossible to go back.